Once known as the Kid from Kalamazoo, in this video, the man from Michigan gives us his insight on how he fishes bass fast with traditionally slow-moving techniques and presentations. So sit back, but don't relax, because when the 2001 Classic champion is pitching to heavy hitters, the action can be phenomenal.
You know, today we're fishing typical pitching and flipping water, real shallow, dirty, isolated cover and grass and things like that. But it's a technique that you can use for a lot of other things. You know, I'll pitch and flip sometimes in 30 or 40 foot of water. It's a great technique to get pinpoint positioning on real irregular deep structure. You know, if you're following a creek channel, all the little turns and things like that, you might miss them with a cast. But if you're watching your electronics and just pitching, you know, 15, 20 foot out of the boat, letting it sink down to the bottom, you're right there on the key spot. So you can use this technique for a lot more than just the traditional shallow cover. We catch a lot of them flipping real deep grass and you know, all types of cover, you know, bridge pilings. You can do a lot of different things with this technique. You know, there's really three basic casts that you need to learn for flipping and pitching. And each one of them serve a different purpose, but they're very important. Each one of them is deadly effective when you get into the right situation. When you want to flip is when you're in really heavy cover and real thick stuff and you really need to get pinpoint presentation, and this is when you're going to be the closest to the fish. I'm going to use my 7.5 foot flipping stick, and I'm basically going to work with as much line as I have hanging to my reel. And from there, you can pull out a handful, and that's all the farther that you're going to fish. And you know, you can use a reel with a flipping feature or one without for doing this, but I'm pretty much going to be just working with this line, and I just run my hand back and forth, and I just swing it out there, and you can just set it into the cover just with the quietest presentation. And this is when you can be really deadly, but you got to be real quiet in the boat. And you know, this is going to work best when it's really gnarly stuff. This is where you use the biggest line and the stiffest rod. I'm just going to get it in there and just really just work it back and forth. You have about a 15-foot range with this technique, and this is just the basic flipping technique. Now the next cast that I use is kind of the short range or the mid-range pitch. And you can either use your 7.5 foot rod or your 7-footer for it. I kind of let the cover determine which rod I'm going to pick up. If it's kind of lighter, sparser, thinner cover, I'll use my lighter rod, my 7-foot rod with that real soft tip on it. It just gives me a little bit better lure control than the big 7.5 foot heavy action flipping stick. But you can do it with both rods. And in this, I'm really looking at about the 30-foot range as being the kind of the optimum distance. It's really good when the water's just stained and you're in real shallow areas where you can't get too close to the fish to spook them. And the best way that I like to do it is I start with the lure in my hand. It gives me a lot of good control to get the lure pointed in the right direction. And basically all I'm going to do is let go of the lure and lift the rod tip as the bait swings out there, just like a pendulum. And the key to this cast is keeping tension on the line through the whole cast. So I'm just going to drop the bait and then just lift the rod tip, and right before it hits the water, I put my thumb solidly and stop the spool and set the bait in real quietly. That's how you get the pinpoint quiet presentation. I'll start it like this, lift the rod tip, and stop it right before it, you know, it gets to the target. I can keep it real low that way, and if I add a little power to it by lifting the rod tip a little harder, you know, you can even slide it or skip it back underneath targets. And this is really good to about 30 feet. And this is probably the most effective and most used casting technique for pitching right here. Deadly technique. The third pitching technique is probably the hardest one to master, and it's the most important one too. This is one that I catch a lot of bass with. It's my long range technique. This is the one you want to use when the water's clear, when it's extremely shallow, when the fish are spooky. It'll get a bait into really hard to reach places. I like to throw it under pontoon boats, underneath docks and things. You can slide it underneath willow trees this way. I can skip the bait right along the water real well. Lure selection is real critical when you're using this type of presentation. You know, something like a jig with a little bit bigger trailer tends to skip and slide better than a plastic worm. tubes can be very good. If you're going to use a Texas rig plastic bait, it's very important with this to have the sinker pegged or to use a screw-in type sinker. I'm going to use a similar cast to the pitch, except I'm going to use the full length of the rod. The same thing applies. I want to keep tension on the lure all the way to the target. And what I like to do is just kind of loop the bait around or send it sideways, and it's kind of a sidearm cast. The same motion though, I'm going to keep that rod tip so where it finishes in the 10 or 11 o'clock position, so I can allow the bait to sink on a slack line. And once it gets in there, you want to watch it real closely. I want to lift the rod tip up, stop the spool, and set it in there real gently. I think when it skips like that into a target like that, the bass aren't necessarily spooked by it. And a lot of times in clear water situations, I think it excites them. As that bait comes sliding back in there. It's really not making a lot of noise, and it's a presentation that you can really get a long ways from the fish and get it into places where other anglers don't get any type of lure. These bass generally don't ever see a lure. Boy, another cast that is just really a variation of the pitch that I'll use a lot of times, especially if I'm in standing timber or in a real tight place where there's, say, a lot of bushes or thick willow trees, and I just can't get a sidearm cast to go in there, is I'll just do what I call the little round and round or around the world type pitch. And I'll just take the bait and loop it all the way around towards me and then send it out there real low to the water. And that allows me to get it into some real hard to reach places. Like I say, usually around timber and things like that, around docks or heavy willow trees. It's just another variation of the pitch that helps me get my bait into places where a bass might be.